The city in Catoosa County between Chickamauga and Ringgold was mere farmland until the Spanish-American War and wasn't even a town then. That came much later, but suffice it to say there would be no Fort Oglethorpe, Georgia, unless first there was a fort. Even though the Civil War battlefield at Chickamauga was preserved as a national park in 1890, a federal law passed in 1896 would allow it to be used for military training. And in 1898, the Army created Camp George H. Thomas to train cavalry soldiers for battle in the Spanish-American War. The area was chosen because of its climate and terrain similarities to Cuba, as well as its availability to rail lines thanks to its proximity to nearby Chattanooga. 79,000 troops were trained at Camp Thomas before it was closed after only 109 days, restoring the park land. But the Army liked the area and wanted to buy land north of the park for a new, permanent cavalry post. 810 acres immediately adjacent to the park were bought by the Army for the sum of $32,574. Work started to build the post in 1902. At the time, it was referred to as the Cavalry Post at Chickamauga, or the New Post. In September of 1903, President Theodore Roosevelt, a veteran of the Spanish-American War, came to the new post to dedicate it. Local resident Frank Wright's father was involved in planning the ceremony.
And he dismounted from this docile old mare you see here and got on this frisky stallion. Well, they were going out to dedicate the Georgia Monument. They had the band all lined up, and everybody saw Roosevelt marching out to going along slowly with the band playing. He stood up in the saddle, waved his hat, and hollered, "Follow me!" And he hit the horse over the butt, and the horse took off with the cavalry and everything trying to keep up with him at a breakneck speed through the park, tearing the bunting off of the surreys, the horses running over each other, the band left completely behind, and everybody screaming and yelling. And when Roosevelt got to the site of the dedication, he stood up in the saddle and waved his hat. And when he came back, he gave my father an autograph program of the time. And he said, "I haven't had that much fun since I was a boy."
The following year, the new post was completed and named Fort Oglethorpe after James Edward Oglethorpe, founder and first British governor of Georgia. Fort Oglethorpe was considered the largest, finest, and most modern military post in the country. At a cost of $1 million to build, the post initially consisted of 74 buildings and housed 50 commissioned officers, 1,200 enlisted men, and 1,500 horses. The 7th Cavalry would be the first unit to call Fort Oglethorpe home. One of the earliest and last remaining features of the military post Fort Oglethorpe is Barnhart Circle and the parade grounds, an irregular oval surrounding a large open field used for ceremony and training and where were constructed headquarters buildings, officers' quarters, non-commissioned officers' housing, and some enlisted barracks. For more than a decade, the post was home to other cavalry units, including the 12th Cavalry. After the 7th left, the 12th was returning from the Philippines. During the 12th's stay at Fort Oglethorpe, the military took the opportunity to increase the quality of training to create the most disciplined, well-trained military in the world. More emphasis was put on education, sending soldiers to advanced classes in a variety of subjects, some not related to their military tasks. Fort Oglethorpe was the vanguard of a new, modern army and a model for the rest of the service. Officers and soldiers enjoyed the post's celebrity among military installations, and the sport of polo became very popular. In fact, the post fielded championship polo teams over the years, a trend that would continue for decades to come. In 1912, Congress authorized expansion of the post from regimental size, that's between 1,000 and 2,000 men, to brigade size, between 2,000 and 5,000 men. More than 6,000 acres of land near the post were already owned by the federal government, so existing budget dollars were used for buildings, expanding the hospital, more stables, and other infrastructure. The timing was fortunate, for the 11th Cavalry was moving to the post, and by the time the expansion would be complete, the Great War in Europe was about to begin. In 1915, 128 Americans on the ocean liner Lusitania were killed in a German U-boat attack, essentially laying the groundwork for America's entrance into the war. At the post, the 11th Cavalry continued to train, and now the CMTC, or Civilian Military Training Camps, sprung up. Starting out as a tent city on the parade grounds, the CMTC trained businessmen, professionals, and students to be future officers in the Army. In 1916, a bill was passed to appropriate $1.5 million to expand Fort Oglethorpe yet again, based on the previous act of Congress calling for the expansion to a brigade-sized post. In 1917, cavalry horses were joined by a mechanical beast for the first time. Early tanks were being tested in the field for use in Europe. In fact, the post had even been considered for use in training pilots to use the new airplane in warfare. However, trench warfare would be a defining course at the post. One of the instructors was then Captain Dwight D. Eisenhower. Lessons learned by medical personnel during training for the Spanish-American War would come in useful, preparing soldiers and medics for life in the muddy, stagnant, bug- and disease-infested trenches in France. Camp Greenleaf, named for one of the farms bought to create Fort Oglethorpe, was hailed as the West Point of medicine. During the Great War, 31,000 enlisted men and 7,000 officers had completed their training here. Fort Oglethorpe was also called into service to house German prisoners of war and civilian detainees, one of which was the conductor of the Boston Symphony Orchestra, Dr. Karl Muck. Muck had even conducted a concert with 100 musicians for a crowd of 2,000 fellow POWs. Around 5,000 detainees were held at Camp McPherson, guarded by a force of more than 400. World War I saw unprecedented activity at the post, which during the conflict was home to cavalry units including the 3rd, 6th, 7th, 10th, 11th, and 12th Cavalries. The end of World War I saw the reduction of Fort Oglethorpe to a peacetime posture. The post was utilized for returning troops to muster out of the service. Those included one very famous face.
Sergeant, who was raised in Upper East Tennessee on the Kentucky-Tennessee line by the name of Alvin C. York, the most decorated soldier of World War I. He was actually mustered out of the Army at Fort Oglethorpe.
By 1919, cantonments were ordered destroyed, including 1,200 buildings. Parts of the Chickamauga battlefield, which had been used for training, were returned to their original appearance. All the while, the 11th Cavalry was leaving the post in June, and in July, the 6th Cavalry would arrive from deployment in France. In June of 1933, black veterans of World War I formed the Civilian Conservation Corps Company 2425 at Fort Oglethorpe. It was called the Booker T. Washington Camp. The men improved national parks, planted thousands of trees, installed erosion dams, and erected stone walls. They even cleared the Bragg Trail here at the Chickamauga battlefield. During this time, Fort Oglethorpe settled into more peaceful activities, including horse shows, polo matches, and parades. The CMTC would also continue preparing civilians for possible service in the military. But while World War I was considered the first modern war, it would not be the last, and when Fort Oglethorpe was again called to duty, it had to be ready for a much different conflict. Just as Fort Oglethorpe was one of the first military posts to see the new tanks used in World War I, it would see many more innovations as the world neared another conflict. Motorcycles, newer improved tanks, and a new vehicle called the Bantam car would be major players in the Second World War. Of course, the Bantam car is better known by the nickname Jeep. They were field tested at Fort Oglethorpe for combat conditions they would see in a multi-theater war. and those Jeeps would play an important role in the mobile surgical hospital that was being developed at Fort Oglethorpe. In early 1941, the 33rd Surgical Hospital was preparing to take surgical, dental, and X-ray equipment to the front lines of the battlefield to treat wounded soldiers more quickly, saving many lives. February 1942 saw the 3rd Cavalry move to Fort Oglethorpe. In the summer of 1942, an African-American cavalry detachment of 900 men arrived for training, and the 65th Medical Detachment reached its full complement of 1,200 men. It's also around this time that another POW camp is built near the post to once again house German detainees. December saw news that the new WAC, or Women's Army Auxiliary Corps, would be setting up a training center at Fort Oglethorpe and to expect up to 8,500 women to start arriving by New Year's 1943. In January, the 3rd WAC Training Center was officially recognized. Special care was taken to keep the thousands of WACs and the few hundred remaining soldiers separate when necessary. In April 1943, President Franklin Roosevelt paid a surprise visit to the area and dropped in on the WAC Center to see those new female recruits. Not to be outdone, celebrities Bing Crosby, Ella Fitzgerald, and Al Jolson all visited the post to entertain the WACs. Even movie studios joined in, with MGM coming to town with box office star Lana Turner in tow to film the movie Keep Your Powder Dry about WACs serving in the Army. In January 1945, the post would welcome what would become history-making WACs in that they would become the first all-black unit of WACs to be sent overseas for duty. The WACs got their extended field service training here before being sent to Birmingham, England, where their unit name would change to the 6888 Central Postal Directory Battalion. The unit distinguished itself by clearing a logjam of 17 million pieces of undelivered mail to Allied troops in record time. As World War II came to an end, so did the need for Fort Oglethorpe. It was hoped that Army schools would be located at the post, but instead it was again turned into a redistribution command, a place for soldiers to muster out and prepare for civilian life. The South Post property was returned to the Department of the Interior, restoring the Chickamauga battlefield. In 1946, the post was inactivated and a year later declared surplus and returned to civilian control. In 1949, by act of the Georgia legislature, Fort Oglethorpe was incorporated as a city.